Hello, my name is Benjamin Hart. I'm an American attorney and the Managing Director of Integrity Legal here in Bangkok, Thailand. In another video on this channel, it was the issue of the Trump administration's recent extreme vetting protocols was discussed heavily. In fact, there's a couple of videos at this point that are on our channel regarding extreme vetting. Extreme vetting, we're sort of seeing it trickle down, or sort of the implementation coming about sort of in a piecemeal manner, which is sort of how these things work when you look at the overall immigration process. But I wanted to go ahead and do this video because I had done some further research and I wanted to provide some further insight with respect to when it might be possible that these extreme vetting protocols might be utilized. And to be clear, as noted in another video on this channel, extreme vetting does not necessarily just apply to those countries which have been placed under the travel ban, or which were put under the travel ban previously and now not under the travel ban, or even, and on top of that, it's also not a good idea to make any assumptions with respect to a specific region on this topic, as it looks to me like extreme vetting protocols are probably going to be implemented broadly throughout the world, although how they're going to be implemented remains somewhat to be seen. The most notable thing about the implementation of extreme vetting from the standpoint of my research is this. There's been a memo, it was noted in Reuters, which is noted on another video on this channel, but there's been a memo that's gone out to embassies and consulates abroad, which has instructed consular officers adjudicating visa matters to go ahead and sort of narrow down subsets or groups of individuals that are sort of deemed where it's sort of deemed that further protocols are going to be necessary to adjudicate an underlying petition or application for a visa to the United States. So what are we talking about here? Basically, they've asked that certain groups be identified, and it's actually post-specific, so jurisdiction-specific. So they've said, you know, look, basically the instructions lay out, look, what may be a group of interest in the country of Hungary, you may have a totally different group of interest in, say, Ecuador, okay? It's going to vary country to country. But what's interesting about this implementation, or what's interesting about this policy, is that the underlying people that they're looking at, once it's decided that it's necessary that there needs to be further scrutiny, these folks are then going to be subject to heightened application procedures, which has been previously noted. Like, for example, the travel history goes further back on individuals who are in these categories. So instead of 5 or 10 years of travel history being requested, you're going to be looking at 15 years. And on top of that, questions such as who funded said travel, etc. These kind of questions are going to be asked. On top of that, things like social media accounts. And it looks like it even may be possible that people are going to want to see inside one's social media. So passwords may need to be provided, etc. I think that may be going a little too far, but at this point, you know, I would sort of say it's not illogical to infer that we could see some seriously invasive sort of questions and information requests. I think the response to anybody who feels that these are invasive is the response is going to be, well, if you have a problem with that, don't apply for a U.S. visa. What's been most notable, the reason for making this video, because everything to this point has essentially been something of a review of what I've previously talked about in other videos. What's been most notable was I was rereading the notice which went out on regulations.gov regarding this, where the Department of State asked for certain expedited processing of the underlying request to change the rules with respect to DOS processing of visa applicants. Pursuant to the Paperwork Reduction Act of 1995, a request was made to expeditiously process this request. Within that request, it was noted that what's interesting to me is the when are we possibly going to see extreme vetting implemented. And the when is answered right here, and I quote from regulations.gov, when the consular officer determines that the circumstances of a visa applicant, a review of a visa application, or responses in a visa interview indicate a greater need for scrutiny. That's the quote to keep in mind on this stuff. That's when it's going to be triggered. So in a way, as we've discussed with respect to consular absolutism and 214B with respect to tourist visas, in a way, it looks to me like this extreme vetting protocol is going to be, I wouldn't say highly discretionary on the part of the consular officer, but there is an element of discretion with respect to these extreme vetting protocols. And that element of discretion creates an element of uncertainty in overall consular processing issues. The better analogy from my point of view with respect to these new extreme vetting protocols, I think the best analogy is to look at the past with respect to the so-called, well, not so-called, the fraud prevention unit of various consulates abroad. The fraud prevention unit is tasked with essentially determining whether or not a visa application might be of interest from a fraud prevention standpoint, and then said application is oftentimes subjected to further scrutiny or further processing when compared to a similar case that didn't go through the fraud prevention unit. So you have two K1 cases, both fiancé visa cases. One of them goes through fraud prevention unit, takes an extra 6 weeks to process through, requires possibly a secondary interview, possibly a phone call to the petitioner, which you're not necessarily going to see with respect to a normal K1 case, and heightened scrutiny with respect to the interview, more questions, etc. Same thing, that K1, same category that doesn't go through the fraud prevention unit, generally is going to process in a relatively routine manner. One interview is going to be what happens in that case as opposed to multiple or maybe two or more. But the long and the short of it is what I'm saying is I think the FPU is the way to look at the possibility of extreme vetting. The difference is in FPU, at least in my experience, one could pretty well tell when an FPU issue was going to arise and prepare for it until we have a better grasp of just exactly what defined groups a specific post deems there to be a need for more scrutiny. Until we figure out what the groups A are and how they're sort of determined, I think it's going to be hard for us to be able to foresee exactly when a case could possibly be placed under heightened scrutiny pursuant to the extreme vetting implementation. And on top of that, the somewhat discretionary nature, in the sense that, look, consular officers have a very difficult job. They're essentially tasked with being the person on the ground in a foreign country, determining whether or not the person in front of them is telling the truth about what they're saying, and also determining whether or not that individual should go to the United States, essentially. So those folks are tasked with a pretty significant job to start with. This extreme vetting, these protocols that they've added on top of that, if a consular officer feels that something is suspicious or there's an issue within the visa application during the visa interview process, or simply just talking to the applicant themselves, and they deem it necessary to place a higher level of scrutiny on that individual, then it seems like it's pretty much going to be the knock-on effect of that is longer processing times, more difficult questions, higher documentation thresholds with respect to explaining one's situation, all of this stuff. I don't think it's necessarily going to be extremely pleasant to deal with those matters, but it looks like it's going to be something we're going to have to deal with here fairly shortly, and the specifics and the details of how that implementation is going to take place remains to be seen.